Good evening. It is April 7th. We are starting a new series this week, just looking at kind of the chaos of the world. And I'll kind of explain exactly what we're going to do over the next few weeks. I do apologize. This lesson's probably going to be a little longer tonight. But we live in a very chaotic and frenzied world. Life is a lot of times dominated by confusion and just constant noise. And I think one of the most consistent things that I read about the teenage experience, I am going to talk about the teenage experience just for a couple minutes, but some of the things that I read and often what I even hear from teenagers is how much stress categorizes their lives. And it's even true of adults now as well. But we face increased expectations and demands. There's this noisy world of social media where we're always connected and we're always managing not only our own issues, but we're trying to manage everyone else's. And we escape from the world to our devices because we want to run from the uncomfortable or the frightening. And what we find there in social media a lot of times in our devices is uncomfortable and frightening. And there's this constant confusion, dizzying news cycle, and everything keeps flooding in. And it's not just a digital frenzy that we face, but even our friendships. And think about this and I'm talking to parents, how hard it is to keep up with who's currently mad at whom in your child's life and which one of your child's friends aren't speaking with them right now. But as a teenager, they can feel abandoned and alone in those times. For some of us, maybe we have unsettling family and home lives. But as a teenager, these are the years in their lives when they get introduced to the fact that people suffer in this world. And a lot of times that doesn't make sense to them. These are some of the experiences that we're going to talk about over the next few weeks. So each week we're going to look at a scene from Jesus' ministry, kind of like what we did with our last series. But tonight I want to show you the peace that Jesus offers in the chaos in our lives. So where we're going to be tonight is in Mark chapter 4. And in Mark chapters 4 and 5, we see Jesus confront the chaos in this world. All of the chaos and the unrest and the opposing forces, but there's a word that Jesus speaks that is louder than any noise in our lives, and that is the word peace. So in this section of scripture, we're going to find and we're going to talk about 3 different stories of Jesus stepping into a broken world and bringing it under his care and his control. He performs 4 miracles that are going to reveal the authority and the remedy that Jesus has over the sea and the wind, demonic possession, sickness, and death itself. That he reigns over all the powers that are hostile to God and brings distress to you and to me. So you go from the large cosmic scale to the individual needs in our hearts. So in our first story, Jesus rebukes the chaos in this world. It's a story that we're well known. It's actually the story that I preached about 3 days after one of the toughest days in my life back in December. But it's a story in Mark chapter 4, starting in verse 35. I'm going to read from the English Standard Version tonight. Feel free to follow along in whatever translation that you're most comfortable with. But it says, "On that day, when evening had come, he said to them, 'Let's go across to the other side.' And leaving the crowd, they took him with them in the boat just as he was, and other boats were with him. And a great windstorm arose, and the waves were breaking into the boat, so that the boat was already filling. But he was in the stern, asleep on the cushion. And they woke him and said to him, Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing? And he awoke and rebuked the wind and said to the sea, Peace, be still. And the wind ceased, and there was a great calm. He said to them, Why are you so afraid? Have you still no faith? And they were filled with great fear and said to one another, Who then is this that even the wind and the sea obey him? This story begins in verse 35 with Jesus leading the disciples across the sea. If you notice, getting out on the water and facing this storm was Jesus' plan. And he doesn't do things haphazardly. He doesn't do things half-heartedly. And reading this story, we have to be able to tell ourselves that there are going to be times when Jesus is going to lead us into chaos. There are going to be times where everything can feel like it's unraveling, but we're right where we're supposed to be. So don't hit the escape button every time. Because too many people, when we face difficulty or something that feels like it's beyond us, we get disillusioned. We think something's wrong. So we either want out of that friendship, or we want out of that school, or we want out of that family. But we have to tell ourselves that we're right where Jesus intends for us to be. So here a storm comes, and it begins to tear into the boat. It begins to fill with water, and apparently it's a storm that was bad enough that, like I said back in December when I preached this story, that experienced fishermen are terrified. It's sudden and it's intrusive, and Jesus is asleep. And we benefit from knowing this story already. But put yourself in the place of the disciples. And now you begin to think that Jesus is out of touch. Everything is going wrong, and he clearly doesn't get it. And this is a little bit of a tangent, but when life begins to scare you, you're going to be tempted to turn and accuse the people that God has put in your life to help you. And you can do that to your parents. You can do that to church leaders. And I say that because here the disciples do that to Jesus. You know, they ask, don't you care? Of course he cares. You know, the whole reason he's in the boat, the whole reason he's on the planet and inside of the chaos of our lives is because he's going to die for them. In moments of tension and fear, our true beliefs get revealed. We don't trust him. But Jesus breaks in verse 39. And he awoke and rebuked the wind and said to the sea, Peace, be still. And the wind ceased, and there was a great calm. He silences this storm that was so threatening. Verse 40, it says, He said to them, Why are you so afraid? Have you still no faith? But notice what happens next in verse 41. And they were filled with great fear. So they go from fear to another fear. You know, they ask, Who is this that even the wind and sea obey him? He's the one who created the land in the sea. They had taken Jesus just as he was in verse 35, and now they see him for who he really is. Like the waves just responded to the man that we've been following. Jesus brings order out of our disorder. And I hope you have a sense of the awesomeness of Jesus here. Because if not, then the chaos that you're going to encounter in this world is going to be overwhelming. Everything's going to lack proportion. Mark here wants to impress upon you an accurate picture of who Jesus is. One day, Jesus will calm the storm by being thrown into it. As our church has been looking at the story, or recently looked at the story of Jonah. Jonah being asleep in the boat and cast into the sea to be swallowed by a whale. Jesus will be cast into death and swallowed by the earth, but come forth bursting on the third day. Jesus kills the chaos in the world by letting it swallow him until it chokes. Jesus and the disciples reach the other side of the sea. When they arrive, there's another storm confronting them. And it's in Mark chapter 5, verse 2. And when Jesus had stepped out of the boat, immediately there met him out of the tombs a man with an unclean spirit. Now, the Bible teaches us that I think there's more to life than what we can touch, see, or put in a test tube. There is a thing called the spiritual realm. This affects us because we have souls. And this passage is painting a portrait of a demon-possessed man. And in verse 3 it says, he lives among the tombs. He made his dwelling in places of death. And in Mark chapter 5, verse 3 and 4, it says, and no one could bind him anymore, not even with a chain, for he had often been bound with shackles and chains, but he wrenched the chains apart, and he broke the shackles in pieces. No one had the strength to subdue him. This was something that natural efforts couldn't fix. It couldn't be controlled. And in verse 5, it says, night and day among the tombs and on the mountains, he was always crying out and cutting himself with stones. He has this pattern of self-injury and self-destruction. And this is a picture of total isolation. This man is utterly alone. He's left to despair. And there is this chaos in the human soul. Whether or not they are demonized like this man, this is something that every person experiences. But if you pay attention to the contradiction in this story, this is a man who runs to Jesus. He identifies Jesus, and he rebukes him. In verse 6 and 7, it says, and when he saw Jesus from afar, he ran and fell down before him, and crying out with a loud voice, he said, what have you done? What have you... Wow. Here in verse 6 and 7, it says, and when he saw Jesus from afar, he ran down and fell before him, and crying out with a loud voice, he said, what have you to do with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? I adjure you by God, do not torment me. There's a man by the name of Sinclair Ferguson. He wrote a book about the Gospel of Mark, and I'm going to read a little excerpt from this story. It says, and he goes on to say, would you not think that a man with such profound need would yield readily to Jesus the deliverer? Theoretically, we would. But to think that would suggest we understand the human heart all too superficially. No man yields to Jesus easily by nature. Tragically, like Legion, men often hold on to their bondage in evil rather than yield to the pain of transformation by Christ's power and grace. We can be just like this man. We can be so close to freedom and yet still wanting to cling to what has held us captive. Notice how Jesus restores him, though, because he takes radical measures. Here in Mark chapter 5, verse 8, says, For he was saying to him, come out of the man, you unclean spirit. And Jesus asked him, what is your name? He replied, my name is Legion, for we are many. And he begged him earnestly not to send them out of the country. Now a great herd of pigs was feeding there on the hillside, and they begged him, saying, "Send us to the pigs, let us enter them." So he gave them permission, and the unclean spirits came out and entered the pigs, and the herd, numbering about 2,000, rushed down the steep bank into the sea and drowned in the sea. The demon's purpose is to destroy the creation of God, and Jesus shows that these forces will never again enter this man's life to torment him. So Jesus restores this man to wholeness. And look at this new picture in verse 15. And they came to Jesus and saw the demon-possessed man, the one who had the legion, sitting there, clothed and in his right mind, and they were afraid. Do these people celebrate what they find? No. They asked Jesus to leave. These men cared more about their herd than they did about the tormented human being, and more than they valued Jesus. Sometimes God's work of restoration in someone else's life comes to a great cost. My question is, do you have patience for that? Because society teaches us that patience is in short supply. And that shows up in the final story we're going to look at. In this story, Jesus allows himself to be interrupted by two needs. And while he displays incredible patience with the people who ask for his help, he also teaches them patience as they experience the fear of their circumstances. So staying in Mark chapter 5, but starting in verse 21, it says, "And when Jesus had crossed again in the boat to the other side, a great crowd gathered about him, and he was beside the sea. Then came one of the rulers of the synagogue, Jairus by name, and seeing him, he fell down at his feet and implored him earnestly, saying, 'My little daughter is at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her, so that she may be made well and live.' And he went with him, and a great crowd followed him and thronged about him. And there was a woman who had a discharge of blood for 12 years. I don't know if you've ever noticed this or paid attention to this, but there are two tales of 12 years here. 12 years ago, a girl was born and a new life entered the world. But 12 years ago, a woman contracted a condition that will define her life. And then fast forward 12 years, this woman is healed, and the day she's healed, this 12-year-old dies. This woman is constantly in pain, suffering from her disease, and is constantly considered unclean by religious people. She's exhausted all her resources and options, and she comes with the touch of faith, thinking, if I just even touch his garment, I'll be made well. And she has genuine faith, but it's a faith that needs instruction. Jesus, not his clothes, healed this woman, because it says power had gone out from him. And Jesus calls for this woman to identify herself. He doesn't want her healing to be in secret, but he wants to use it as an opportunity for discipleship. And he tells her to go in peace. Peace is more than just a temporary healing, because he says your faith has saved you. And he lost power so she could gain strength. And one day he would lose his life so that she and all of us could live forever. It was a day that we just celebrated a few days ago. But notice that Jesus takes the time to engage this woman. And try to put yourself in this story, because imagine the tension. You have the anxiety of Jesus, the worry of the disciples, and Jesus is perfectly composed and just giving this woman attention as if she's the only thing that matters. But it seems like a catastrophic delay, because continuing on in this story, in verse 35, it says, while he was still speaking, there came from the ruler's house some who said, your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any further? But overhearing what they said, Jesus said to the ruler of the synagogue, do not fear, only believe. He's saying, I'm right on time. Trust me. Be patient with the way that I'm going to resolve this. It's going to be more than you ever expected. One of my favorite preachers is Timothy Keller, and I remember specifically watching a sermon that he had said, and he said, beware that when you go to Jesus for help, you will both give to and get from him far more than you ever bargained for. And I think we're going to need that kind of truth both now and in the future, because in this story at Jairus' home, they're preparing for a funeral. In verse 38, it says, they came to the house of the ruler of the synagogue, and Jesus saw a commotion, people weeping and wailing loudly. And when he entered, he said to them, why are you making commotion and weeping? The child is not dead, but sleeping. And they laughed at him. But he put them all outside and took the child's father and mother and those who were with him and went in where the child was. Taking her by the hand, he said to her, little girl, I say to you, arise. And immediately the girl got up and began walking, for she was 12 years of age. And they were immediately overcome with amazement. He tells this girl, get up. He lifts her out of death, and in Jesus' hands, death is nothing but sleep. And I'm going to close with this, verse 43. And he strictly charged them that no one should know this and told them to give her something to eat. And I close with that because Jesus leaves the scoffers in their unbelief. They might think, well, maybe she was just sleeping after all. Even watching a miracle happen right in front of their eyes, it doesn't change the people. They need new hearts to receive Jesus for what he is. Jesus still raises the dead. Maybe Jesus is telling you in your life, it's time to get up, it's time to walk around, it's time to follow me. And I hope that you'll let him lift you out of whatever you're in. Think about it this week. Where does life feel chaotic for you? Where are you experiencing fear? What feels bewildering to you? And my hope is that you guys talk about this tonight as a family. The questions have been emailed out. The questions are in the description box of either YouTube or Facebook, however you're watching this. But I pray for you guys as a family to maybe, if there's something that you guys need to face as a family, to face that. Maybe you guys aren't facing anything, but maybe there's something that's going to be brought up tonight that you didn't know about. Whatever it is, I truly hope that these have been a blessing to you and your family as you participate in these. Thank you for those that are. We're going to continue to do these until the fall when we start Wednesday nights back up. Again, thank you so much for everything that you guys do. Thank you for everything you've done for me. Again, I can't wait as we start to meet back up again. Remember, church services have started back up, as well as Bible classes. Bible classes are at 9 on Sunday mornings with services following at 10 a.m. So I hope that as more and more people are getting vaccinated and more people are feeling more comfortable with coming back to church, that we see you again. And so thank you so much, and I will see you guys next time.